The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode of The Lifestyles and Rich and Famous, we are shining the spotlight on the eccentricities and excesses of Arkham's resident millionaire, Preston Fairmont, the new investigator for the rogue class who will be released in the Circle Undone. Fantasy Flight Games recently released a preview for Mr. Fairmont as well as the secret investigator Joe Diamond, so I thought I would share a few first impressions and deck ideas so you can get the biggest bang for your buck once you open your wallet for the Circle Undone. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. You can't defeat the Mythos by just throwing money at it, or can you? Preston Fairmont certainly thinks so. Let's find out if he's right. Preston Fairmont, the millionaire, has 1 willpower, 1 intellect, 1 combat, and 1 agility. He has the Silver, Twilight, and Socialite traits, 7 health, and 7 sanity. He has the following game text: anytime you gain 1 or more resources from a card effect, place them on family inheritance instead of in your resource pool. His Elder Sign effect is +0, and you may spend 2 resources to automatically succeed instead. Typically, it's at this point in the episode that I break down the investigator's base skill values and examine their strengths and weaknesses, but I think we can all agree that Preston's base skill values are terrible. I'm going to blame his sheltered upbringing and pampered lifestyle for his lack of willpower, intellect, combat, and agility. You'd think the rich and famous would have the time and money to excel at something, but not Preston. On the plus side, Preston's health and sanity values are 7 apiece, which makes him extremely resilient to damage and horror. Needless to say, Preston's base skill values, or lack thereof, suggest he will be vulnerable to every dreadful thing the encounter deck can dream up. Sanity-blasting treacheries such as Rotting Remains and the Yellow Sign will turn him into a quivering pile of goo, while Arcane Barrier and Visions of Future Past will mill through his deck quicker than he can say Wizard of Yogg-Sothoth. Meanwhile, Preston's dismal intellect, coupled with a few simple obstacles such as obscuring fog or locked door, will make it difficult for him to discover clues in a timely fashion and, by extension, advance the act deck. Even Preston's finest tuxedo may not be enough to persuade Jazz Mulligan or Constance Dumaine to help him during parlay tests. Preston is almost certain to end up poisoned, entombed, or dashed upon the rocks at the base of a crumbling precipice if he ventures into the jungle due to his low combat and agility skill values. Enemies will lick their chops at the prospect of an easy meal, since Preston is too weak to either fight or flee with any consistency. I could go on to list every way that scenarios will chew up Preston and spit him out, but I think you get the point. Preston's skills suck. The real question is, what is he going to do about it? Now, a few of you probably took one look at Preston's base skill values and immediately wrote him off, and I don't blame you. We've seen this type of approach to investigator design before, and the result, by many accounts, was disappointing. I, for one, was quite optimistic when FFG spoiled Calvin Wright back in March 2018. I felt even more confident about his abilities after I beat the Knight of the Zealot campaign with him. Calvin's stats were terrible for sure, but his ability seemed strong enough to balance things out in the end. Then I played the Forgotten Age with Calvin, and my perspective on poorly skilled investigators changed dramatically. I tried to keep this channel family-friendly, but holy shit did I struggle with Calvin. I can't speak to multiplayer, but playing Calvin solo is the closest I've come to punching a hole through my computer screen in a white-hot rage. The Untamed Wilds and the Doom of Estley are challenging scenarios, sure, but honestly, when I look back at those games, I didn't even come remotely close to beating them with any consistency. More often than not, it took me longer to set up the scenario than to go down to defeat, and I play 99% of my games on Octagon, so the setup time is pretty minimal. Calvin was simply too slow and too vulnerable during the early stages of the scenario to put up much of a fight, And honestly, it didn't take much to derail him. Dropping a overgrowth on the expedition camp was enough to send him into a downward spiral, and you don't have to play the Forgotten Age for that type of situation to crop up. Set up the gathering, drop an obscuring fog on the study, and you're in for a rough game as you struggle to discover the clues necessary to advance to Act 1A. If you had a bad experience with Calvin like I did, I don't blame you for shortchanging Preston. That said, I'm convinced Preston is a much, much better investigator than his base skill values suggest. If Calvin's answer to dismal base skill values is to take a lot of damage and horror, Preston's answer is to throw a lot of money at the problem, lots and lots of money. Preston's personal wealth makes Jenny's trust fund look like chump change. Resource management is the heart and soul of a Preston Fairmont deck, so it's worth taking a moment to understand the relationship between Preston's resource pool and his signature asset, Family Inheritance. It's a permanent asset with the boon trait. It has the action, move all resources from this card to your resource pool. It also has the following forced effect. When your turn begins, place 4 resources from the token pool on this card. Resources on this card may be spent as if they were in your resource pool. Discard all resources from this card at the end of your turn. Now, Family Inheritance is an asset with a capital A. At the beginning of each of his turns, Preston places 4 resources on Family Inheritance to spend as he sees fit. That's in addition to the 5 resources that he receives at the start of the game for a whopping total of 9 resources. 4 resources is a lot of scratch in the Arkham Horror LCG, and Preston will likely need every penny to purchase assets and events while boosting his base skill values. If Preston is unable or unwilling to spend the resources on Family Inheritance, he has the option to move them to his resource pool as an action. That's an extremely important bit of game text for 2 reasons. First, Preston's ability prevents him from gaining 1 or more resources from card effects. Preston can still take an action to gain a resource, and he still gains a resource during the upkeep phase, but if he plays Emergency Cash or Hot Streak, for example, those resources go on Family Inheritance, not in his resource pool. That game text is also important because Family Inheritance has a significant drawback. If Preston doesn't spend or move the resources on the card before the end of his turn, they disappear. You can't store resources on Family Inheritance indefinitely. You either use them during Preston's turn or you lose them. The relationship between Preston's ability and Family Inheritance has a couple of important ramifications that are worth discussing. First, if Preston needs to fill his resource pool quickly, say in preparation for the upcoming Mythos phase, his only option is to hit up Family Inheritance, and that takes time. Family Inheritance has the potential to provide Preston with unrivaled burst economy, but he needs to take an action to do it. Preston can't, for instance, play a card such as Watch This during his turn to generate resources for his resource pool, since those resources will go on Family Inheritance, where they may go to waste. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that Preston will be in a position to take that action to move resources if, say, he is surrounded by enemies, or he absolutely positively needs to move to a different location. This is going to be less of an issue in multiplayer than in solo, where spare actions are fewer and farther between. If you're playing a quote-unquote big money deck that wants to accumulate as many resources as possible, and you have a chance to hit up the Fairmont family for some resources without hurting your tempo, seriously consider taking it, because you never know when you'll have another chance to do it without suffering any negative consequences. If you're playing that style of deck, it's important to make sure that Preston's personal finances are in order just in case Family Inheritance runs dry. The second ramification is that it's slightly more, let's say, awkward for Preston to play economy cards such as Emergency Cash and Hot Streak unless he's confident that he can spend all of those resources during his turn, since they'll be placed on Family Inheritance and then discarded at the end of his turn if he doesn't. If Preston wants to save those resources for a rainy day, his ability forces him to take one action to play the economy card and a second action to move the resources to his resource pool from family inheritance. Spending 2 actions to do something other investigators can do in 1 isn't necessarily the best use of Preston's time. That begs the question as to whether you should play cards such as Emergency Cash in a Preston deck at all, but that's an argument for later in this video. Family Inheritance provides Preston with a pile of resources, and it's an amazing source of burst economy, but it's also going to be empty during most of the round, including the Mythos phase. That's when things can get dicey. If Preston draws an encounter card during the Mythos phase that forces him to make a skill test, he must rely on the cards in his hand and or the resources in his resource pool to prop up his skill values. That's a tall order considering Preston's base skill values are 1s across the board. Let me give you a simple example. If Preston draws Rotting Remains, he needs to pass a Willpower 3 skill test or take 1 horror for each point he fails by. Preston has no chance of passing the skill test with a base willpower skill value of 1, so the odds are he's going to be taking 2 or 3 horror. Let's assume that Preston can't afford to take 2 or 3 horror though. Now what? I'll be charitable and assume that Preston has a dig deep in play. If you're playing on standard difficulty, the rule of thumb is that you want to be about 2 up before the pull from the Chaos bag. That means Preston needs a skill value of 5 to be reasonably safe from the Rotting Remains. If you commit Guts to the skill test, your willpower skill value is then 3. Unfortunately, you're still unlikely to pass the test with a skill value of 3, which means you won't get to draw a card from Guts either. That's not a great play. If you're committed to passing the skill test, you really need to lean into it and spend 2 resources to trigger Dig Deep twice, boosting your willpower skill value to 5. If you don't have a Guts handy, you'll have to spend 4 resources to trigger Dig Deep 4 times. Needless to say, 4 resources is a lot to ask from an investigator, especially if that investigator needs to commit a pile of cards and or resources to every skill test that he takes. Navigating the Mythos phase can be tricky for Preston, so it's important to have some cards and or resources available somewhere in case you find yourself in a do or die situation. I've talked a lot about the relationship between Preston's resource pool and family inheritance, but it all boils down to one question. Does family inheritance provide enough resources to make up for Preston's dreadful skills? After playing a bunch of games with Preston, I think that it does, although I do have a few reservations about him, which I will discuss later in this episode. There are a lot of interesting decision points that come and go as you manage the resources in Preston's pool and the resources on family inheritance. I tend to spend the resources on family inheritance first, saving Preston's for a rainy day. Once I've got a few assets down on the table, I'll hit up family inheritance more often to shore up Preston's resource pool. If I'm trying to accumulate as many resources as possible, Preston's resource pool is usually in the double digits towards the end of a scenario, although it doesn't take much to drain it. It goes without saying that the more skill tests Preston makes, the faster he'll burn through his resource pool. Combat in particular can be very expensive, which is why I prefer to evade enemies if I can. That said, I've also found myself in situations where I've been unable to move resources to Preston's resource pool from family inheritance, and I've still managed to limp along, so he's a lot more resilient than he looks. Preston's Elder Sign ability is +0, and you may spend 2 resources to automatically succeed instead. This is among the better Elder Sign abilities, but I'm biased since it has already saved my bacon on more than one occasion. Let me give you an example. I was playing extracurricular activity, and I needed to pass an Intellect 3 skill test to parlay with Jazz Mulligan. Intellect is Preston's Achilles heel at level 0 since there are no rogue or survivor talents that let him convert his resources into Intellect. I had to commit Intellect skill icons to the test, and I was rapidly running out of those. After several failed attempts, I drew an Elder Sign, and the problem was solved. The fact of the matter is that Preston's base skill values are so bad that he's bound to run into a skill test that are just that are going to be difficult, if not impossible for him to pass, no matter how many cards and or resources he throws at the problem. As long as Preston's got 2 resources, his Elder Sign ability gives him a slim chance of success, no matter the odds. You never know when you're going to draw an Elder Sign, but chances are you will succeed automatically when you do, which is fantastic. I've already discussed Preston's signature asset at length, so that leaves his signature weakness, Lodge Debts. It's a 10-cost event with the Pact trait. If you play Lodge Debts, you remove it from the game. It has the following forced effect. When the game ends or you are eliminated, if Lodge Debts is still in your hand, you suffer 1 mental trauma. As far as signature weaknesses go, Lodge Debts doesn't seem all that bad. Preston has 7 sanity, so taking 1 mental trauma at the end of a scenario isn't the worst thing in the world, unless of course you are driven insane and end up taking 2 mental trauma. I've seen that happen with Zoe's signature weakness, and it's a bitter pill to swallow, especially if it happens towards the beginning of a campaign. I like Lodge Debts because it really doesn't do all that much during a scenario other than count against your hand size and potentially tax your resources, of which Preston usually has plenty. Hand size matters in the City of Archives and scenarios that include the Delusions encounter set from the Path to Carcosa, but that's about it. Most of the time you'll draw Lodge Debts and sit on it harmlessly until you can see an opportunity to pay it off. If you're playing in standalone mode, you can ignore it completely. Lodge Debts will come back to haunt you if it's still in your hand at the end of a scenario, so you may want to deal with it as long as you've got the resources to spare and you're not going to cripple your board state in the process. Preston is capable of generating plenty of resources during a scenario, and he can split the cost of Lodge Debts between family inheritance and his resource pool. That means he needs only 6 resources in his resource pool at the start of his turn to play Lodge Debts. That's not a very high bar to clear. That said, 10 resources and an action is a lot to pay for nothing other than the warm fuzzy feeling that comes with knowing that you're not going to take a mental trauma at the end of the scenario. Preston's willpower is pretty low though, so if Lodge Debts is in your hand and there's even a remote chance that you'll go insane, you should probably deal with it before that happens. I've drawn Lodge Debts only once while testing Preston. It happened while I was playing the Essex County Express, and I still managed to deal with it even though that scenario is notoriously fast. Claws of Steam prevented me from moving for a turn, so I used the opportunity to pay off the debts. It hardly slowed me down in the end, and so I suspect I'll end up paying off Lodge Debts most of the time. I'm not going to sweat it if I take a mental trauma here and there, though, either. FFG's preview article was kind enough to spoil Preston's deck building options and requirements, so we can do some theory crafting about what a Preston Fairmont deck will look like. Let's start with the basics. Preston can use rogue and neutral cards as well as survivor cards up to level 2. Preston may be a rogue with the Silver Twilight trait, but he's definitely one of the good guys, so his deck may not include cards with the Illicit trait. That eliminates a significant number of cards from contention, including both levels of the 41 Derringer, Burglary, Chicago Typewriter, Colt Vest Pocket, Contraband, Fence, Knuckle Duster, Liquid Courage, Lockpicks, Lupara Payday, both levels of pickpocketing, and both levels of Switchblade. Lockpicks is one of the cards on that list that immediately jumped out at me, since it has been a staple of rogue decks since it came out in the Path to Carcosa. However, if you think about it for a moment, it's not a great loss, since Preston's skill value during the investigation with Lockpicks is only 2. The injunction against illicit cards has a significant impact on Preston's offensive options. In fact, if Preston wants to carry a weapon at level 0, he's restricted to baseball bat, fire axe, gravedigger shovel, knife, and kukri. Once Preston earns some experience points, he can add old hunting rifle, ornate bow, and the time-worn brand to his arsenal. We'll ignore knife and kukri for the time being and focus on the survivor weapons. Typically, fire axe is the go-to weapon for survivors and off-class survivors. As long as you've got the resources to spare, you can boost your combat skill value by up to 6 with the axe. Once you've run out of resources, the axe hits for 2 damage. Preston can certainly generate enough resources to pump his combat skill value to 7 with Fire Axe. Unfortunately, he usually has too many resources in his resource pool to get the damage bonus. If Preston is dealing only 1 damage per attack, he'll need to take 2 or even 3 fight actions to take down an enemy. And if Preston is spending 2 or 3 resources during each of those fight actions to have a reasonable chance to connect with his swings, that is going to get ridiculously expensive in a hurry. Now you can work around this problem to a certain extent with family inheritance, which allows Preston to enjoy the best of both worlds. As long as Preston doesn't have any resources in his resource pool, you can spend the resources on family inheritance to pump your combat skill value with Fire Axe and get the damage bonus. It's an amazing combination when you can get it to work, but it's not for every Preston build. If Preston's goal is to accumulate as many resources as possible, you may want to consider Baseball Bat or Gravedigger Shovel instead. Preston has a combat skill value of 3 while armed with either weapon, which is pretty average. He will almost certainly need to commit additional cards and or resources while taking fight actions with those weapons against most enemies. If I had to pick one for solo, I'd probably go with the shovel. It takes up only 1 hand slot, so Preston has a hand free for a flashlight. And he can certainly discard the shovel to discover a clue if necessary. In multiplayer, I'd probably go for the baseball bat instead to deal some extra damage, but that depends a lot on what role Preston will fill in the group. Preston's lack of good offensive options is one of the reasons I prefer to play the evasion game with him. The other reason is that evading enemies tends to require fewer skill tests than killing them, and if there's one thing Preston likes, it's making as few skill tests as possible to conserve cards and resources. As a rogue off-class survivor, Preston has a wealth of evasion options open to him, including bait and switch, cunning distraction, dumb luck, elusive, survival instinct, and think on your feet. Once Preston earns some experience, he can pick up valuable tools such as close call or cat burglar, who, much to my surprise, is not illicit. I guess Preston doesn't mind having someone else do his dirty work for him after all. Now, enemy management is just one piece of the deck building puzzle. Passing skill tests and discovering clues are also vital to your success on the campaign trail. Preston has several options to help him pass skill tests. The first option is to boost his base skill values using assets such as Dario El Amin, Dark Horse, Peter Sylvester, and Newspaper. Now, I realize that it seems somewhat counterintuitive to play Dark Horse in a Preston Fairmont deck. I mean, why would an investigator with access to unparalleled resource generation consider playing with an empty resource pool? But hear me out, because I think it can be a very effective strategy. While the resources on family inheritance may be spent as if they were in Preston's resource pool, they are not in his resource pool. That's an important distinction for cards such as Fire Axe, which we looked at earlier. It's also an important distinction for another Dark Horse staple, Madame Lebranche. Madame Lebranche is one of the few ways that you can work around the restriction on family inheritance. Let me give you an example. If Preston's resource pool is empty, you may trigger Madame Lebranche during any player window that opens after his turn ends to give him a resource. That resource will be placed on family inheritance, but it won't disappear until the end of Preston's next turn. That means it will be available during the subsequent Mythos phase to boost Preston's base skill value with a talent or cards such as Lucky. If you time your Lebranche triggers just right or play her in combination with a card such as Lone Wolf, you can end up with 2 or 3 extra resources on family inheritance during Preston's turn. That can be extremely powerful if you play your cards right. Playing talents that allow Preston to convert his vast wealth into skill value bonuses is another way he can pass skill tests. Hard Knocks and Dig Deep are the only talents available to him at level 0. Hard Knocks provides combat and agility bonuses, while Dig Deep, which hasn't seen much play up to this point, provides willpower and agility bonuses. The obvious omission here is Intellect, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly. Once Preston has earned some experience points, he can pick up several other talents, including Streetwise from Blood on the Altar, Moxie, Plucky from Echoes of the Past, and Cornered and High Roller from The Boundary Beyond. There are several events, such as Lucky, Live and Learn, and Narrow Escape, that Preston can pass skill tests as well. Players should already be familiar with Lucky, which is among the best cards in the game. Live and Learn, a Survivor event from the Heart of the Elders, provides a similar bonus as Lucky, although you have to play it only after a skill test you failed ends. Narrow Escape, a fast event from Black Star's Rise, also provides +2 skill bonus on a skill test, but you need to cancel an attack of opportunity against you by an enemy to get it. For example, if Preston is engaged with an enemy and he takes an investigate action, he can play Narrow Escape to cancel the attack and get +2 intellect on the skill test. That bonus may not be enough unless you are at a low shroud location, but I think you'll agree that every little bit helps. Finally, there's at least one card in the Circle Undone that is designed with wealthy investigators such as Preston in mind. Money Talks is a free event with the Favor and Gambit traits. It's fast, and you play it when you initiate a skill test. It has the following game text. Instead of the skill test indicated for this test, willpower, intellect, combat, or agility, this is a resource skill test. Your base skill value for this test is equal to half the number of resources in your resource pool, rounded down. Now, Money Talks is a great addition to a big money Preston build. The ability to turn any skill test into a resource skill test can be a game changer, although Preston does need a lot of resources to make it work. How many resources is a lot? Well, assuming a base skill value of 4 is above average, I'd say Preston needs at least 8, although 10 or 12 would be better. The resources on Family Inheritance don't count, so make sure you shored up Preston's personal finances if you're planning on playing this card. Obviously, Money Talks doesn't make much sense if you've decided to go with a Dark Horse build. If Preston has an Achilles heel, it's his ability to discover clues at the beginning of a solo campaign. Preston has a variety of options to help him discover clues, including assets such as Flashlight, Lantern, Newspaper, and Gravedigger's Shovel, events such as Look What I Found, Live and Learn, Lucky, and Winging It, and skills such as Perception, Rise to the Occasion, and Unexpected Courage. Unfortunately, when you've got an intellect of 1, even a lowly 3 shroud location can become a significant barrier that will stretch those tools to the breaking point. Let me give you an example. Whenever I play an extracurricular activity with Preston, I feel as though I'm barely scraping by in the intellect department. Half of the locations in that scenario, the Administration Building, Humanities Building, and or Library, have a shroud value of 3 or 4. The Humanities Building can be a real pain since there are 2 clues there. There have been times that I've had to use a combination of tools such as a Lucky and a Look What I Found just to discover a single clue. That's not a very efficient use of resources. When you throw in the parlay action to take control of Jazz Mulligan, and that scenario can be very touch and go if you run out of intellect skill icons at the wrong time. It doesn't get any easier in Curtain Call, where 5 of 7 locations have a shroud value of 3 or higher. The Untamed Wilds is slightly less demanding since only half of the locations have a shroud value of 3 or higher. That said, you've got to deal with Ichtaka, who forces you to pass an Intellect 4 parlay test or several Combat 5 skill tests before you can progress. That is going to be extremely rough on poor old Preston. I think Preston's life would be much, much easier at the beginning of a campaign if there was a talent that let him leverage his vast resources to raise his intellect skill value during investigate and parlay actions. Unfortunately, no such talent is available to him at level 0. Now, it should be said this problem all but vanishes once Preston purchases Streetwise. It's earning that 3 experience points with one hand tied behind your back. That's the tricky part. Based on what we know about Preston Fairmont from the preview article and some of the testing I've done, we have some idea what solo and multiplayer Preston builds will look like. Now, my goal here is not to discuss every weird and wacky deck that you can build with Preston. I'll leave that to other members of our clever and endlessly inventive community. Instead, these decks are just rough drafts, basic frameworks that can serve as a jumping off point for your own ideas. The solo Preston deck that I built focuses on discovering clues while evading enemies. Flashlight, Gravedigger, Shovel, Look What I Found, Lucky, Narrow Escape, Perception, Rise to the Occasion all help Preston discover clues, which is one of his big weaknesses at level 0. Besides helping Preston cheat a clue, the Gravedigger's Shovel can deal with small, annoying enemies. If you're looking for a little more oomph in combat, you could swap the shovel for the fire axe. I've included 2 talents, Dig Deep and Hard Knocks. Either can provide the agility boost Preston needs to escape from enemies. I decided to go with Leo DeLuca in the ally slot. I've tested Dario Elamine and Leo, and I think I prefer Leo's extra action to Dario's bonuses, which become slightly less valuable after Preston purchases Streetwise. Narrow Escape gives Preston another bonus. You could swap it for more evasion tech if necessary. Rise to the Occasion is an obvious addition in a Preston build since Preston has a base skill value of 1 across the board, while Resourceful is also another Survivor staple. I especially love the ability to commit Resourceful to a 1/1 Investigate action to retrieve Rise of the Occasion, which you can commit to the second Investigate action. Now, the observant among you will notice this deck has only 28 cards. The deck should also include 2 copies of Money Talks, which can help Preston with any skill tests. Let's talk about resources for a moment. I haven't been playing Emergency Cash in my Preston decks, and honestly, I haven't missed it at all. In my experience, Family Inheritance generates enough resources that Emergency Cash is simply unnecessary. I do like the drip economy that Lone Wolf provides each turn, since it doesn't require an action. I've gone back and forth on Take Heart a few times. Preston's base skill values are so low that he's bound to fail a skill test here and there, and 2 resources and 2 cards is an awfully nice reward for screwing up. Take Heart also happens to be one of the few ways Preston can add resources to Family Inheritance when it's not his turn, which is quite valuable. Committing Take Heart to the right skill test can be a tricky decision though, so I'm not entirely sold on it. You may want to consider swapping it for Not Without a Fight, which would give Preston a couple more combat and agility skill icons to work with when the enemies inevitably appear. Building a Preston deck for multiplayer is more challenging since the contents of the deck depend a lot on the role he'll be playing in the group. Preston's base skill values are so bad that you could focus on either investigation, combat, or evasion. That said, Preston doesn't really have the intellect to be a clover, especially at level 0. Preston's weapon options aren't that great either, so I'd probably lean towards evasion. Preston does have high health and sanity though, so he may make a decent tank. The following deck focuses on combat and agility to leverage Preston's tanky health and sanity. Baseball Bat is the weapon of choice here since he can get it back with Resourceful if it breaks. I've supplemented the bat with Backstab and Sneak Attack. Hard Knocks, Fight or Flight, Lucky, and Not Without a Fight and other skills can help Preston land his fight or evade actions. I went with Peter Sylvester in the ally slot, but I was tempted by Stray Cat for some additional evasion. The 2 missing cards here should be Money Talks. Finally, I'd like to share with you the Dark Horse Preston deck that I built. The deck includes staples such as Dark Horse, Fire Axe, and Madame Labranche, in addition to solid cards such as Lone Wolf, Resourceful, and Rise to the Occasion. Family Inheritance enables Preston to experiment with a slightly higher cost curve than traditional Dark Horse decks. The only thing that worries me about this deck is its ability to pay off his Lodge debt should the need arise. Fortunately, it hasn't come up in testing. Theoretically, it shouldn't take Preston long to gather 10 resources to pay them off, so I'm not too worried about it. Before I wrap up this episode, let's talk briefly about upgrades. I'd be willing to argue that Streetwise is almost mandatory if you're playing solo or multiplayer. It fixes Preston's intellect issue, and it can help him evade enemies right out of the gate. Preston is a rogue, so at least 1 copy of Adaptable is almost a given. Charon's Obol is also a very tempting early purchase, depending on the campaign and your comfort level with risk. After you pick up those cards, Preston is really spoiled for choice. If you want to focus on discovering clues, Preston has more than enough resources to pay for Lola Santiago. He can also afford Lucky Dice if you want to get some Chaos Bag manipulation. If you're playing an evasion build, Cat Burglar is another solid pickup. If you're playing a tankier build in multiplayer, the level 2 version of Peter Sylvester is a good choice. Or you could simply go for the power cards, such as Ace in the Hole, Charisma, Key of Ys, or the gold pocket watch. As you can see, there are a lot of ways that you can build a Preston Fairmont deck depending on your strategy and player count, and I expect his options will only increase as more cards are released during the Circle Undone cycle. That's going to do it for my look at Preston Fairmont. I hope that you found some of the information useful. Preston's base skill values don't inspire a lot of confidence at first blush, but I'm here to tell you that he puts his money where his mouth is. Between his signature asset and some of the other rogue and survivor cards at his disposal, Preston has the tools that he needs to be a strong investigator, whether you're playing solo or in a group. He also happens to be quite a bit of fun to play once he gets rolling. I've played most of the scenarios in the Dunwich Legacy at least once with Preston, and once was with a big money deck that leveraged Streetwise, and once with a Dark Horse build. Both decks performed extremely well. In fact, the Streetwise was the only card I purchased during my first run through the campaign, and the deck was surprisingly solid. I probably would have even been able to beat Where Doom Awaits, too, if I hadn't been forced to play Hide and Go Seek with 2 Avian Thralls for 3/4 of the game, which is not bad for a badly tuned deck that was mostly level 0 cards. I was also pleasantly surprised by the strength of the Dark Horse build. Like I said, it seems counterintuitive, but somehow it just works, at least in the Dunwich Legacy campaign. I'm looking forward to testing Preston in other campaigns once he is officially released to see if he can handle it in The Path to Carcosa and The Forgotten Age. The Circle Undone is shaping up to be another great addition to the game. I had to put my money on Daniela Reyes, the mechanic, being the rogue investigator in this cycle due to the tarot card theme, but I will happily play Preston when he is released. I do have a soft spot for rogues, and this millionaire is right on the money. That's going to do it for this Deck Tech. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.